Imagine this. You're on a flight heading home after a long trip. The hum of the engines is soothing, the cabin lights are dimmed, and most passengers are lost in their own worlds, some dozing off, others scrolling through movies or quietly, or chatting. It's just another routine flight. But what happens next is anything but routine. For one young black girl, this flight would become a nightmare, a moment that would test her courage and dignity in the face of blatant racism. And for one off-duty FBI agent, it would become a call to action, a moment to stand up for justice when it mattered most. This is a story about prejudice, power, and the unexpected heroes who rise when the world seems to turn a blind eye. It all started innocently enough. The girl, let's call her Maya, was traveling alone. She was just 17, heading back to her family after visiting relatives. She had her headphones on, lost in her music, when a flight attendant approached her. At first, it seemed like a routine check. Maybe her seatbelt wasn't fastened or her tray table wasn't up. But the tone of the flight attendant's voice was sharp, almost accusatory. Maya, confused, took off her headphones and asked if everything was okay. What followed was a series of events that no one on that plane could have anticipated. The flight attendant, a middle-aged woman with a stern demeanor, began to berate Maya. She accused her of being disruptive and disrespectful, even though Maya had done nothing wrong. Passengers nearby exchanged glances, unsure of what was happening. Maya, trying to stay calm, explained that she hadn't done anything to warrant such treatment. But the flight attendant wasn't having it. Her words grew harsher, her tone more aggressive. And then it happened. A racial slur slipped out. The cabin fell silent. Maya's heart sank. She felt exposed, humiliated, and utterly powerless. But this story doesn't end here, because in the midst of this injustice, someone was watching. Someone who couldn't stand by and let this happen. Enter John, an off-duty FBI agent who had been sitting a few rows back, quietly observing the situation. John wasn't the kind of guy who sought out drama. He was on his way home after a long work trip, looking forward to some downtime. But when he saw what was happening to Maya, something inside him snapped. He knew he had to step in, but what could he do? He was off-duty after all, and yet the look on Maya's face, a mix of fear, anger, and helplessness, was enough to push him into action. John stood up, his presence immediately commanding attention. He approached the flight attendant, his voice calm but firm. "Ma'am, I think you need to take a step back," he said. The tension in the air was palpable. Passengers held their breath, unsure of what would happen next. The flight attendant, clearly caught off guard, tried to defend her actions, but John wasn't having it. He knew what he had heard, and he knew what he had seen. This wasn't just about a misunderstanding, it was about something much deeper, something much uglier. As the confrontation escalated, the plane's captain was called to intervene. The other passengers, now fully aware of what was happening, began to murmur among themselves. Some recorded the incident on their phones, while others simply watched in disbelief. Maya, still seated, felt a mix of emotions. Relief that someone had stood up for her, but also fear of what might come next. Would the flight attendant face consequences, or would this incident be swept under the rug like so many others? And then, just as things seemed to reach a boiling point, the plane began its descent. The captain announced that everyone needed to return to their seats and fasten their seatbelts. The confrontation was put on hold, but the tension remained. As the plane touched down, Maya couldn't help but wonder what would happen next. Would John's intervention make a difference, or would she be left to deal with the fallout on her own? And what about the flight attendant? Would she face any real consequences for her actions? This is where our story pauses, but it's far from over. What happens when the plane doors open? Will justice be served, or will this incident fade into obscurity? The answers lie ahead in the next chapter of this gripping tale. But one thing is certain, this is a story about more than just a racist flight attendant and a brave FBI agent. It's a story about standing up for what's right, even when it's hard. It's a story about the power of one voice to make a difference. And it's a story that reminds us all that no matter how dark things may seem, there's always hope for justice. Stay tuned, because this is just the beginning. As the plane taxied to the gate, the cabin remained eerily quiet. The usual post-flight chatter was absent, replaced by an uncomfortable silence that seemed to stretch on forever. Maya sat frozen in her seat, her hands gripping the armrests tightly. Her mind raced, replaying the confrontation over and over again. She couldn't shake the feeling of humiliation, the sting of the flight attendant's words still fresh in her mind. But there was something else, too, a glimmer of hope. John, the off-duty FBI agent, had stood up for her. He had seen what happened, and he hadn't stayed silent. For the first time since the ordeal began, Maya felt like maybe, just maybe, someone was on her side. John, meanwhile, was already thinking ahead. As the plane came to a stop, he glanced at Maya, giving her a reassuring nod. He knew this wasn't over. He had seen enough in his line of work to know that situations like this rarely resolved themselves cleanly. The flight attendant, whose name tag read Linda, had already retreated to the front of the plane, her face a mask of defiance. John could tell she wasn't going to back down easily. He also knew that the airline's protocols would likely kick in soon, and he wanted to be ready. He pulled out his phone and began typing a quick message to a colleague, filling them in on what had happened. If things escalated, he wanted to make sure there was a record of the incident. As the seatbelt sign dinged off, passengers began to stir. Some grabbed their bags quickly, eager to get off the plane and away from the tension. Others lingered, glancing at Maya and John, clearly curious about what would happen next. A few even approached Maya, offering words of support. "I'm so sorry that happened to you," one woman said, placing a hand on Maya's shoulder. "You didn't deserve that." Maya nodded, grateful for the kindness, but still too shaken to say much. She just wanted to get off the plane and call her parents. She needed to hear their voices, to feel grounded again. But before she could even stand up, the captain's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we ask that you remain seated for just a few more moments. We need to address a situation before disembarking." The murmurs in the cabin grew louder. Passengers exchanged worried glances. Maya's heart sank. She had a sinking feeling that this was about her. John, sensing her anxiety, leaned over and whispered, "Stay calm. I've got your back." His words were reassuring, but Maya couldn't help but feel a knot of dread forming in her stomach. A few moments later, the cockpit door opened and the captain stepped out, followed by Linda and another flight attendant. The captain, a tall man with a no-nonsense demeanor, scanned the cabin before his eyes landed on Maya and John. He walked over, his expression unreadable. "I understand there was an incident during the flight," he said, his voice calm but firm. "I'd like to speak with everyone involved before we proceed." Maya felt her throat tighten. She didn't want to relive what had happened, not here, not in front of everyone. But before she could say anything, John stepped in. "Captain, I'm John Carter, off-duty FBI," he said, showing his badge. "I witnessed the entire incident, and I can assure you this young woman did nothing wrong. The flight attendant's behavior was completely out of line." The captain's eyes flicked to Linda, who was standing a few feet away, her arms crossed. She looked defiant, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. The captain sighed, clearly weighing his options. "I appreciate your input, Agent Carter," he said, "but I need to hear from everyone involved before making any decisions. Let's step off the plane and discuss this privately." Maya's heart raced as she stood up, her legs feeling like jelly. She grabbed her bag and followed the captain, John, and Linda off the plane, aware of the dozens of eyes watching her every move. As they walked down the jet bridge, she couldn't help but feel like she was being led to some kind of interrogation. What if they didn't believe her? What if they sided with Linda? The thought made her stomach churn. They were led to a small office near the gate, where the captain gestured for them to sit. The room was cramped, with a desk, a few chairs, and a window overlooking the tarmac. Maya sat down, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. John took a seat beside her, his presence a small comfort. Linda sat across from them, her expression still, defiant. The captain closed the door and turned to face them. "All right," he said. "Let's start from the beginning. I need to understand exactly what happened." Maya took a deep breath and began to recount the events, her voice trembling at first but growing steadier as she spoke. She told the captain about how Linda had approached her, the accusations, the racial slur, and the way she had felt humiliated in front of everyone. John chimed in, corroborating her story and emphasizing the severity of Linda's actions. Linda, for her part, listened silently, her face growing redder by the minute. When it was her turn to speak, she didn't apologize. Instead, she doubled down. "I was just doing my job," she said. "This girl was being disruptive, and I had to address it. If she took it the wrong way, that's not my fault." The captain frowned, clearly frustrated. "Linda, this is a serious accusation," he said. "If what they're saying is true, this goes far beyond a simple misunderstanding." Linda opened her mouth to respond, but before she could say anything, there was a knock at the door. The captain opened it to reveal 2 airport security officers. "We got a call about a disturbance on the plane," one of them said. "We need to speak with everyone involved." Maya's heart sank. This was spiraling out of control. She had just wanted to get home, to put this whole ordeal behind her. But now it seemed like it was only getting bigger, more complicated. John, sensing her distress, leaned over and whispered, "It's going to be okay. We'll get through this." But Maya wasn't so sure. She couldn't shake the feeling that no matter what happened, this incident would follow her for a long time. As the security officers began to ask questions, Maya noticed something out of the corner of her eye. Through the window, she could see a small crowd gathering near the gate. Passengers from the flight were standing there, some holding their phones, others talking animatedly. A few were even filming. Maya's stomach twisted. She realized that this wasn't just about her and Linda anymore. This was becoming a public spectacle, and in the age of social media, she knew it wouldn't take long for the story to spread. The security officers finished their initial questioning and stepped outside to confer with the captain. Linda sat in silence, her defiance starting to crack. John pulled out his phone again, this time to check the news. His face darkened as he scrolled through the headlines. "It's already online," he said quietly to Maya. "Someone must have posted about it." Maya felt a wave of panic. She hadn't asked for any of this. She just wanted to be treated with respect. But now, her face, her story, were out there for the world to see. As the minutes ticked by, the tension in the room grew thicker. The captain returned, his expression grim. "We're going to need to take official statements from everyone," he said. "This is going to take some time." Maya nodded, feeling numb. She just wanted to go home. But she knew that wasn't going to happen anytime soon. Outside, the crowd near the gate was growing larger. News crews had arrived, their cameras trained on the office window. Maya could feel the weight of their gaze, the pressure of their expectations. And then, just as she thought things couldn't get any more overwhelming, her phone buzzed. It was a text from her mom. "Are you okay? I just saw something online. Call me as soon as you can." Maya's eyes filled with tears. She wanted to call her mom, to hear her voice, to feel like everything was going to be okay. But she couldn't. Not yet. Not with so much still hanging in the balance. The story was far from over. What would happen to Linda? Would the airline take responsibility? And what about Maya? How would she move forward after this? The answers were still unclear, but one thing was certain. This was a moment that would change everything. And as the cameras rolled and the world watched, Maya knew that the fight for justice was just beginning. As the minutes dragged on in the cramped office, Maya felt the walls closing in. The weight of the situation pressed down on her, and the constant buzz of activity outside the door only added to her anxiety. The security officers had taken her statement, and now they were speaking with Linda, whose defiant demeanor had started to waver. Maya could hear snippets of their conversation, Linda's voice rising in frustration, the officers trying to keep her calm. John sat beside Maya, his phone buzzing incessantly with messages from his colleagues and updates from the news. He kept his voice low as he filled her in. "This is getting a lot of attention," he said. "People are already calling for accountability. But we need to stay focused. The truth will come out." Maya nodded, but her mind was elsewhere. She couldn't stop thinking about the crowd outside, the cameras, the strangers who now knew her face and her story. She felt exposed, like her life was no longer her own. And then there was her mom's text, still unanswered. She knew her parents would be worried sick, but she couldn't bring herself to call them yet. What would she even say? How could she explain something that she didn't fully understand herself? Meanwhile, outside the office, the scene was chaotic. Passengers from the flight had gathered near the gate, some filming on their phones, others talking to reporters who had arrived on the scene. Social media was already ablaze with hashtags like "Justice for Maya" and "Racism in the Skies." Videos of the confrontation, filmed by passengers, were going viral. People were demanding answers, calling for Linda to be fired, and urging the airline to take responsibility. The story had struck a nerve, tapping into a larger conversation about racism and accountability that had been simmering for years. Back in the office, the captain returned, his face grim. "We're going to need to move this to a more secure location," he said. "The media is swarming, and we can't have this turning into a circus." Maya's heart sank. She didn't want to be paraded in front of cameras or turned into a spectacle. But before she could protest, John stepped in. "We'll cooperate," he said, "but Maya's privacy needs to be respected. She's been through enough already." The captain nodded, but Maya could tell he was under pressure. The airline's reputation was on the line, and he had to navigate this carefully. As they were escorted through a back hallway to a more private area, Maya caught a glimpse of the crowd outside. Reporters were shouting questions, cameras flashing. She kept her head down, her heart pounding. John stayed close, shielding her from the worst of it. "Just keep moving," he whispered. "We'll get through this." But Maya couldn't shake the feeling that her life was spiraling out of control. Once they were settled in a more secure room, the questioning continued. This time, a representative from the airline's corporate office joined them, a woman named Karen, who introduced herself as the head of customer relations. She spoke in a calm, professional tone, but Maya could sense the underlying tension. "We take these allegations very seriously," Karen said. "But we also need to ensure that we have all the facts before making any decisions." Maya felt a flicker of frustration. It felt like they were stalling, trying to protect the airline's image rather than addressing what had happened. John, however, wasn't having it. "With all due respect," he said, "this isn't just about facts. This is about a young woman who was humiliated and targeted because of her race. That's not something that can be swept under the rug." Karen nodded, but her expression was guarded. "I understand," she said, "but we have protocols to follow. We'll be conducting a full investigation, and we'll take appropriate action based on the findings." Maya felt a surge of anger. She didn't want to be part of an investigation. She wanted someone to acknowledge what had happened, to apologize, to make it right, but it seemed like that wasn't going to happen anytime soon. As the conversation continued, she found herself tuning out, her mind drifting to the people outside, the passengers who had witnessed the incident, the strangers who were now rallying behind her. She wondered what they thought of her. If they saw her as a victim or a symbol, she didn't want to be either. She just wanted to be Maya. Meanwhile, Linda was in another room, being questioned by security and airline officials. Her initial defiance had given way to a mix of anger and fear. She knew she was in trouble, but she wasn't ready to admit fault. "I was just doing my job," she kept saying. "If people are twisting this into something it's not, that's not my problem." But the evidence was mounting. Passengers had come forward with videos and statements corroborating Maya's account. Linda's career was hanging by a thread, and she knew it. As the hours passed, the story continued to spread. News outlets were picking it up, and social media was flooded with reactions. Some people praised John for stepping in, calling him a hero. Others criticized the airline for its handling of the situation. And then there were the trolls, people who dismissed Maya's story, who accused her of exaggerating or lying. The comments were hurtful, but Maya tried to ignore them. She had bigger things to worry about. By the time the questioning wrapped up, Maya was exhausted. The airline had promised a thorough investigation, but she didn't feel reassured. John offered to drive her home, and she accepted, grateful for his support. As they walked through the airport, she could feel the eyes on her, the whispers following her every step. She kept her head down, focusing on putting one foot in front of the other. When they finally reached John's car, Maya let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for everything." John nodded. "You don't have to thank me," he said. "I just did what anyone should have done." But Maya knew it wasn't that simple. Not everyone would have stood up for her the way he had. Not everyone would have risked their own comfort to do what was right. As they drove away from the airport, Maya stared out the window, her mind racing. She knew this wasn't over. The investigation, the media attention, the public scrutiny. It was all just beginning. And then there was Linda. What would happen to her? Would she face consequences, or would she walk away unscathed? Maya didn't know. But one thing was certain. This incident had changed her. It had opened her eyes to the ugliness in the world, but it had also shown her the power of standing up for what's right. The road ahead was uncertain, but Maya knew she couldn't back down. She had to see this through, not just for herself, but for anyone who had ever been treated unfairly because of who they were. The fight for justice was far from over, and Maya was ready to take it on, one step at a time.